So welcome everybody to the seventh in a series of teach-ins that started this past summer here in the Office of Diversity and Inclusion with co-sponsorship and support from the School of Public Health, as well as the Center for Diversity and Inclusion in Higher Education here at the University of Maryland. We are so thankful to you all that you have decided to spend a part of your afternoon with us, especially on this rainy afternoon here in November. We are planning for you a conversation today including some great voices here from our campus. We're going to talk to you about practicing anti-racism. Throughout this series, what we have been hearing repeatedly is, how do you do that? What does this look like here in my office? Or how can I do that in the classroom? And so we have been trying to be responsive to those questions and to those needs. Today, we planned anti-racist practice. And you see the panelists there, but I'll come back here in just a second to introduce them. Before we get into the conversation, though, I want to start off with the Land Acknowledgement that has been created by some of our colleagues over in MICA, as well as with folks from the Piscataway tribe. Every community owes its existence and strength to the generations before them around the world, who contributed to their hopes, dreams, and energy to making the history that led to this movement. Some were brought here against their will. Some were drawn to migrate from their homes in hopes of a better life. And some have lived on this land for more generations than can be counted. Truth and acknowledgement are critical in building mutual respect and connections across all barriers of heritage and difference. At the Office of Diversity and Inclusion, we believe it's important to create dialogue to honor those that have been historically and systemically disenfranchised. So we acknowledge the truth that is often buried. We are on the ancestral lands of the Piscataway people, who are among the first in the Western Hemisphere. We are on the indigenous land that was stolen from the Piscataway people by European colonists. We pay respects to Piscataway elders and ancestors. Please take a moment to consider the many legacies of violence, displacement, migration, and settlement that bring us together here today. Thank you all. I hope that you are also reflecting on the land where you find yourself and who were the ancestral people whose land was stolen from them as well. So today, again, we have invited some of our colleagues from across campus to be here with us today. Crystal Davis is in the School of Theater, Dance, and Performance Studies. Jazmin Pichardo is here in the Office of Diversity and Inclusion with me. Shige Sakurai is in the LGBT Equity Center, and our moderator for the day will be Dr. Rossina Zamora, who is an assistant clinical professor in the College of Education. Before they come on, though, I just want to reorient us again to this conversation about anti-racism. Many of you have heard me talk about this definition across campus, and you've also heard me refer to Dr. Kamara Jones's work, but I always like to start it with this as a grounding part of the conversation. So here we are again, Dr. Kamara Jones, who is a public health expert in our country and has been on our campus before, is currently at Harvard University as a fellow there working on some interventions around systemic racism. And she has offered us a definition from, I actually heard this on a news podcast from her a few years ago. And if you were to look her up and look at her writing, you would also see a very similar way that she defines racism. But she says that racism is a system. It's not a personal moral failing. It's not even a psychiatric illness. It's a system of power. And it's a system of doing two things, of structuring opportunity and of assigning value. And it does those things based upon so-called race, based on the social interpretation of how we look. Now, here on campus today, you'll hear from our experts really talk about the classroom, they'll talk about programming, they may talk about policy, but they're going to talk about a range of areas where this seems really important. And the reason why I generally use this definition is because it sets us up to really think about how opportunity gets structured in favor of certain people while also disfavoring certain people, and how it is that in the course of structuring opportunities, usually in favor of white folks or in favor of men folks, that we also inherently communicate or implicitly communicate that some people are not as valuable, and while other people's are valuable, right? And so I want you to be holding that definition and looking for our panelists as to be talking about how opportunity structures are created, as well as how value is assigned. The other piece that becomes really important here for us is that we also want to be giving you or steering you in the direction of what anti-racism would look like. We're implicitly wanting you to walk away from this conversation, or explicitly wanting you to walk away from this conversation, thinking about behaving differently, because we think of anti-racism as just that, behavior. And we're also wanting you to think about that there could be some real important aspects to this anti-racism perspective that we want you to be picking up, which is really about increasing your capacity to address racial justice by naming, understanding, being accountable for, and then actively working to provide remedies for this system of racial stratification that structures opportunity and assigns value. Because we have practitioners today, I'm not going to go into a lot of examples around this, but I'm going to bring them into the conversation, even as I phase myself out of the conversation. So I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Rossina Liu, who's going to get us started asking our panelists some questions today, and they're going to talk to you. And as they talk to you, realize a few things. You can engage in the chat with them. If you'd like to be able to do that, some of them may be paying attention to that and they'll send you some responses. If you have questions for the entire panel, we're going to encourage you to use the Q&A function to bring your questions to them that way. And then we'll come back at closer to the end of this program to actually engage in some broader questions, answers from what you've actually contributed here, as well as what you contributed when you registered for today's program, okay? So with that, I'm going to go away and I'm going to invite Dr. Liu and the other panelists to come on for this conversation. Take it away, you all.
Thank you, Dr. Carlton Green. Thank you also to the Office of Diversity and Inclusion, School of Public Health, and Center for Diversity and Inclusion in Higher Education for including me on this anti-racist teach-in. Thank you to all my colleagues on this panel. I'm very grateful to be in your company. Again, my name is Rossina Zamora Liu, and my pronouns are she, her, hers. I am very delighted to be here today, and I appreciate the focus on doing the doing of anti-racist work. To help us start this conversation today, I'd like to invite our panelists to consider the first question with Shige, if you would not mind sharing your expertise on this first question. Given your area of expertise, how do you bring an anti-racist lens to your day-to-day practice? And then if you could elaborate on what contributed to your developing of this approach and perspective.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Shige Sakurai. I go by they, them pronouns. I started making some notes on this and I started seeing some categories or themes that arose for me. And so I'm curious what other panelists might also have on this. But I thought of 3 areas of practices for me. One is grounding practices. Another is maybe behavioral or cultural shift. And another is more structural and policy analysis. So my work involves a lot of different things, working with individuals, with students, with other staff and faculty. It can involve program work, it can involve advocacy and policy work, so it kind of runs the gamut. Some of the ideas I was thinking about for grounding practices, and also like how did I get some of this, and I was thinking back to, you know, what were my early social justice and activist days and what did that look like for me to learn. And I remembered one of the first LGBTQ plus conferences I went to, Barbara Smith was there, Mandy Carter was there. And Mandy Carter is this amazing Black lesbian activist from the South. And one of the things that she said, and I don't think she invented it, she said she didn't come up with it, but that that really resonated for me is it about justice or just us? And just reminding myself of that, like, especially as I was going to a queer conference and thinking, we're going to talk about queer stuff. What does that mean? You know, and as a teenager at that time, this is like 20 years ago, to really get deeper into that, right? To remember that intersectional piece. And I'm sure we'll talk more about justice and what that means as well. But to me, it's also just a grounding practice and thinking about anti-racism in all our contexts, including for me, working in an LGBTQ plus context. So a lot of history work, listening to elders, knowing about some of our past, knowing that at UMD we had a Black LGBT group that was founded in the 90s, having some sense of the history, I think provides me some grounding to do the work today. For the behavioral and cultural shift kinds of practices, I thought a lot about comfort with silence and also comfort with anger. And how I think, especially among different subgroups of people of color, we have very different cultural ways of engaging, right? And engaging with problems. And sometimes we need silence to be able to get into the conversation, to be able to reflect, to be okay with the discomfort or the not knowing. And sometimes we need anger to hear what's really in people's hearts, what's really hurting people right now, what's giving people passion and power for the next thing. And I think that even in group for just BIPOC communities, that in and of itself is something that I think is an example of anti-racist practice, is to get comfortable with both of those things. For other behavioral and cultural shift, for me, a lot is just lifting up new voices, going to local activists and finding local folks for when we're doing programming, and not always going to like who's on the speaking circuit and who has the resume of I've spoken the most at the most fancy events or something like that, to really, I think, widen the sort of set of voices that we're paying attention to. And then on the structural policy analysis level, there's so many things that I think we can do to apply anti-racism lenses. In my LGBTQ plus professional association, for people that work in like LGBTQ plus centers around the country, one of the things we did was to create an anti-racism chair within our organization. I think it was in 2006, and I was the first anti-racism chair for my professional org. And so we were able to do some analysis on how did anti-racism look for every board member, for every volunteer, by having one-to-one conversations with each person, by creating structural ways in which, by having that anti-racism role within the organization, somebody was tasked with trying to create accountability, with trying to advance that conversation, instead of only saying, well, it's up to everyone to do that. Well, yes, it is up to everyone to do that. Also, accountability mechanisms and centralized expertise can be extremely helpful. There's a lot of other policy examples that I have of like ways of thinking, and that I encountered early in my career, of thinking about things like men who have sex with men and blood donation policies, and how so much of the work on that was like centering white gay people and the donor of the blood, when I was like, what about the patients receiving the blood? Or what about bone marrow transplants or other things that were related to this policy issue? And a lot of those were affecting people of color. They were affecting mixed race people in specific ways. And we didn't have ways of talking about that. So trying to shift the conversation a little bit to center what did impact look like in different ways for different people. And similarly, like I was involved a lot early in my career on hate crimes legislation. And, you know, in 2003, talking about it with people. And I think for me also, like learning at that time more about like, let's think critically about what is justice. Let's think about incarceration. And yes, we want to expand hate crimes to include these different categories like LGBT people or homeless people, or other categories that were not really being tracked and included. But why? What is the point of these laws? And to ask these bigger questions, and to realize that penalization is not necessarily the focus that we all want to have. Some of us want to focus on providing supports to communities when they've faced harm. Some of us want to focus on data and tracking. And so having those are still important tools, but how do we then interface with this mainstreamed version of hate crimes work, which is wanting to incarcerate people usually for longer, and even like death penalty stuff that was coming up in that conversation. So there's a lot of complicated, I think, ways to think about policy that goes beyond just here's my single issue framework of like, I'm queer and I just do queer stuff. Well, if you say that, that just becomes basically dominant queer stuff, right? It becomes like men, it becomes cisgender, it becomes white. And so immigration is a queer issue, incarceration is a queer issue. There are so many other lenses and ways of thinking about these things. So that's my my spiel of some of those different layers, going from grounding practices to like behavioral, cultural, to that structural, systemic level.
Thank you, Shige. You brought up so many points, and one thing that I was thinking about as you were talking were a couple questions that I hope the rest of the panelists could also build on. Is the whole idea of comfort in anger and comfort in silence. I love that. And what would it mean to witness that, though, through an anti-racist lens? What does it mean for people within our community, but also outside of it? Because we know that the notions of civility is often very based on white expectations and white norms, right? And it's racist. It's racist because it silences BIPOC community members. So what does it mean then to bear witness to that? And then in addition to that question, if the rest of the panelists could also consider is, what are some overt and less overt or nuanced challenges that you have experienced in terms of your work in anti-racist practices? So those are two very big different questions, but the anger question, if I may invite you all to think about.
I can jump in, at least in thinking about your second question in particular. Just in terms of like what are some of the nuances. I think there are ways that we make this assumption that how people come into anti-racist work is this binary of like, you're either doing anti-racist work or you're not. And it really is a bit more of a spectrum. Anti-racist, because of the summer that we had, because of national Black Lives Matter movement demonstrations, anti-racism has become a buzzword within DEI work. And so a lot of the work that I'm actually doing is trying to support folks in getting some clarity around what do they mean by anti-racism? What also do they mean by diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? That we all come into these terms with really different backgrounds, perspectives, and experiences. And so some of the nuances are like, are we actually getting some clarity around what we mean when we use these terms? And are we also being honest and transparent about who and what we're talking about when we're using these terms, right? That to say BIPOC, when we're actually specifically talking about Asian Americans or Black folks in particular, that actually means something. And so part of my role on campus, in addition to doing some capacity building in classroom spaces, but also in programming outside of classroom spaces, is really inviting folks to think about what do you mean by the language that you're using? And in particular, what is your discomfort or struggle around specifically naming identities, specifically naming Blackness? The amount of times that I'm working with folks on campus who want to do anti-racist work, but at no point name race in particular, name Blackness in particular, or want to conflate color blindness with anti-racism because they're thinking, well, I treat everyone the same, but I also want to do anti-racist work. We actually have to spend some time unpacking how white supremacist ideologies are at work, even as we're trying to do anti-racist work, right? That level of vigilance is actually really an important part of the practice and a part of our reflection as practitioners.
Thank you, Jazmin. That's a really great point in terms of our avoidance of anti-Blackness and calling it out for what it is. I think what you're saying is also the importance of understanding what BIPOC actually means. For those of you in our audience, we know it stands for Black, Indigenous, and people of color, but it's very important to also understand that it's more than just the naming. It comes with it history, right? And power and asymmetrical power dynamics and different experiences with oppression. And the notion of Black community members versus non-Black people of color. And we share very different experiences of oppression. We are non-white, so therefore the centralizing of BIPOC, but within each of those naming those categories, it's also comes with history that is important for us to acknowledge. Thank you. Crystal, did you want to add to it?
I wanted to jump in here because as a dance person, I work in the bodies, and I talk about how the body is something you carry around your entire life. It was there the whole time. It saw everything. It saw everything you did. It saw everything you missed. It felt everything you felt, right? So that there is this amalgam that walks around with us of all the complexities that Jazmin and that Shige have already talked about, right? And that for me, it almost feels like a spiraling of as identities or parts of our identity come to the fore and feel relevant or feel slighted or feel powerful or feel dismissed, right? And that those things can be very complicated. And they for me in the classrooms and in the movement studios, happens often in a very individualized way, right? So one Black student may have a completely different sensibility and feeling and experience of a thing of another Black student, right? Even in my partnership now with a person who is Black, I am feeling that he is from the North and I am from the South, right? Like I am feeling that, right? So that these things can ebb and flow and be up and down in a way that it is great to be able to kind of triangulate and speak and give voice to an experience, but also to remember that that voice, once you've named it, doesn't stay static, right? That over time it may shift, and just to hold space for that, that you can anchor in a moment, an identity or an experience, but that doesn't reduce down to only that moment being true all the time. So I wanted to talk about that. And I loved Shige's conversation about adjacency, right? Of being adjacent, that you can be racist in your practice and be an advocate in other spaces while still holding space for anti-racist approach and worldview and perspective, even while you're working in other areas. And what I like about that so much is that I often, say when I find students that are really, really passionate about anti-racist work, I'm like, yes, but what niche? You can't do all the things, right? Where else is your passion where these things can intersect, right? Because sometimes the label that we put is so massive. It's like, find your niche. What is your passion? What is your one carving out? Otherwise, it does become too complex and overwhelming to address, right? So what are the adjacencies that are passionate and that are living for you that you can then kind of triangulate a space where I got this. This is the part that I can really affect some change, right? So you don't have to be responsible for all the things anti-racism, right? It's a lot.
That makes me think about when we're doing coalition work then, right? And what are some of the challenges that we see then? Because you're absolutely right, Dr. Davis, the idea of there has to be a point of focus, right? And we also hear a lot of, well, if you focus on one, then you're gonna decenter another. What is your response? And I'm gonna open that to the rest of the panelists. How do we navigate those tensions?
I think in a lot of ways, it is really holding the both and, right? That like, we have terms like POC and BIPOC because we recognize that there are some commonalities across oppressions, and really that like the center of these oppressions, right? It's white supremacy, it's heteropatriarchy, it's neoliberalism. And we also understand that while that's the center, it impacts us differently, right? Because the system values us differently. And so the struggle tends to be that because we may focus on the oppressor is white supremacy, we actually then gloss over the differences that exist among and between us. And so I really struggled for a long time with the term POC, because it actually didn't create space to be able to talk about like cross-group differences or intra-group differences among people of color. It didn't create space to talk about how we are marginalized and oppressed in different ways. I think BIPOC gets us a little bit closer, right? In understanding that Black folks have a history of having their labor and their body exploited, right? That Indigenous folks had their lands taken from them, right? And then we still have to really reckon with like who we're lumping in under POC, right? How are Latinx folks racialized in particular ways? How is that racialization also fluid because of like the phenotypical differences among Latinx folks? And then with Asian American experiences, right? Like how did they come to the States, right? What were their histories of oppression? And so a lot of this coalition work is really creating spaces for the both end. Like, yes, we are oppressed by the same system and we're also oppressed in different ways. And we can also enact that oppression against one another, right? In terms of like horizontal oppression.
Thank you, Jazmin. Shige, did you want, I saw you keep nodding and I just want to see if you have anything you'd like to add.
Oh gosh, there's so many pieces. I think a little bit where I want to take us is also like, how do you concretize all these things into specific actions and practices, and not just sort of a mindset or model for how you might approach it. And I think one thing that comes to mind to me is that I don't actually think that there's one right way to do this work. There's probably multiple right ways, or ways that we're not sure. We think, let's try this thing and maybe it works well and maybe it doesn't. But to me, that's about the kind of like feedback that we constantly need to listen and to continue to grow. So it's not like I'm now an anti-racist person and I have this like magical toolkit that nobody else has and just do these things. But at the same time, I think it's more than just debating with ideas and having the right ideas and the right viewpoints on things. So I was thinking of more specific things I could share maybe to bring that up. One is, and it's still a little bit idea for me, is like going, so like, for example, we might share pronouns or we might do land acknowledgement. How I only learned earlier this year that land grant institutions are not because they were granted the land that they reside on necessarily. It's because they were granted dozens of parcels of land across the continent that were taken or stolen from indigenous peoples at various points that were usually then sold off into an endowment fund. And that's where the grant part of it comes from. So there's the piece where I think we acknowledge the land that we're on, but we don't always acknowledge the lands that were taken to benefit us. But it's more than acknowledgement. And a lot of people have said, how do we, like, you can't do decolonization work without actually giving land back to indigenous people. And so I want to, start to get to like, what's then the practice that gets us more that direction. For me, it might be that I want to start personally donating to indigenous organizations, or even ones that specifically put land in the hands of indigenous people and organizations every time I make a land acknowledgement. So I'm sitting here thinking, I want to start tracking that. This isn't something I've done yet, but it's something I'm sitting here thinking, how do I make this more real and not just like an idea or a goodwill piece, right? Similar with like reparations for Black folks. And so there's so many, it can't just be like I said pretty words and now we feel good and move on. There's so much more work than that to actually do. I think about it on a programmatic level in terms of things like, there's not necessarily one right choice for how to design a program, but sometimes you have choices like, do I make this a kind of anyone that wants to do the program can join, or do I have an application process? If I have an application process for, say, an LGBT program, am I asking about other demographics? Am I asking people why this program would benefit them? And to the question, I think, I think that we're answering is how, what do you center? And I think you center the need. I think you center the groups that have been marginalized, disenfranchised, made vulnerable, oppressed. And so we don't run these programs just because it's fun to run programs. We run these programs because we're trying to create an impact. And so I think when you ask certain questions and look at applicants holistically, you start to realize and think, maybe I should prioritize these certain applicants and make other people wait a little bit longer to see if we have enough space in the program, because I'm seeing that this person's saying, this was my experience. Here's how being an international student from a country that maybe executes gay people might be somebody I want to prioritize, right? To be in this LGBTQ plus program. And that has all these like racial elements, dynamics, and components too, right?
Thank you.
Yeah, can I actually jump in with what Shige was saying? It reminds me a lot in the arts about the compositional or creative approach, right? Just creativity, just the capacity to imagine things to be different in a solution-oriented way, right? Just to get in a practice of that, of imagining not just one possibility, but to Shige's point, here is the issue. What are the different ways individually that we feel resolution can come, right, off of that situation? So it reminds me a little bit of in a dance program, you might have you have to make a dance. It has to involve a jump, a spin, and a melt, right? So you have this goal, you have your confines of what can or can't be done, and then everyone actually generates a different perspective on their solution, right? So the practice of both remembering that no one solution is going to suit every person, right? And that there is a practice of creating solutions while also naming the specificities of what will or won't work, right? And that it's a really important space to be in, right? To remember that there are multiple options for success at a lot of these challenges.
Thank you. If I would like us to just move on to the next question, if I may. I think that we've touched many of the points of question 2, but I'd like to ask Jazmin in particular to consider, how do you help people become more anti-racist and justice-oriented? How do you bring an intersectional perspective to your work that acknowledges how racism and other oppressive forces affect the lives of women, trans folks, people who are disabled, immigrants, and so on?
Yeah, I think a lot of it, we really can't underestimate the value of stories and experiences, right? That people don't just experience their lives. I don't just experience my life, right, as a Black Latina woman, right? I also experience it as being cisgender, as being able-bodied, as being middle class, right? That like all of those things are a part of my experiences. And that while these experiences and these narratives are important, they also aren't enough. That's so often the way we want to step into anti-racist work within our institution is around let's create spaces for people to share narratives, to share their experiences, and assume that empathy will naturally come from those experiences, and that will then turn into some action. What I've actually seen happen is people share the ways that they are oppressed and marginalized across systems of power. And the response is sometimes, oh my God, I feel so deeply, and I'm also so grateful that's not my struggle, right? So there are ways that people can share experiences, and what comes out of it is sympathy and not empathy. And so what I think we often don't do is contextualize these narratives within that system, those systems of power, right? That they don't just exist in a vacuum. They are connected to history. They are informed by legacies of exclusion. They are connected to the ways that our institution serves as a microcosm for broader issues in our society. And so when people are sharing those stories, it's not just about that personal experience, but it is also like a way to pinpoint how systems are working in our everyday lives. And if we can start there to move from, oh, this is a really moving story, to actually, no, I also need to think about the ways that, how am I filling the gap between my values and my actions, right? And that actually gets us a little bit closer to justice, that it's not just about, I have these values and these beliefs. You're also doing some self-interrogation around, where do you fall short of these values? Where have you upheld these values, but also your behaviors and actions show something differently? And how do we move closer to alignment and congruence?
Very nice. Thank you, Jazmin. When you're talking about empathy, the implied notion of empathy is that if you can empathize, then you are a good person. We privilege good intentions, and yet good intentions do harm all the time.
Exactly.
So that is a great point in thinking about, we do that in education. We teach empathy through literature. I find that incredibly problematic, and because it's impossible, that empathy and the difference between empathy and sympathy, as you've noted, is such an important piece to acknowledge.
I'll even, Rossina, even to your point, I'll even jump in that the privileging of good intentions is even a power structure there, right? We don't always privilege everyone's good intentions, right? There are some organizations or large corporations that we don't privilege, right? You know what I mean? There's a navigation there about what they're intending or what they're not intending. And we do or don't allow based on the power that's in the room, and the assumptions we're making about other people. So even that is contextual, right? It depends on where you are and who you're talking to and how you're thinking about the other person even. So it's even important to consider that when you're in relationship with people or organizations, that am I doing it? And if so, why am I doing it for this person or this organization? And I'm not feeling that way and not feeling that sentiment for another.
Crystal, so in the arts, when you're thinking about the creativity, this is making me think of, when we're talking about empathy, the notion of art is empathy, right? That we've seen the meme, right? How do you address that in your classes and with your students in terms of art and empathy?
Yeah, art, empathy, and kind of bias, right? Bias is kind of where my research has landed right now. And in conversations with those that use implicit bias to kind of avoid biases in kind of STEM areas or places where objectivity is really important, in those conversations, it popped out to me that the arts are about doubling down on the bias, right? Here is my bias in my dance, the way I want to do it, right? In my lived experience, this is what it would manifest as, right? All the way. And that my bias I share forward in my creative work, and then it is received in a particular way based on the socialization, based on where I'm showing it, right? Based on my audience. And that there are a number of different ways to hold space for that. I will say in the arts, my goal is about holding space for people to say their say, right? And the only thing that I'm there as a facilitator to do is to ask questions of clarity to help myself understand where they're coming from, or help them further articulate what they're trying to voice, right? To give voice to. There are different sensibilities in the arts, though, that you can have. It's interesting that we call it creativity, but a lot of it is can be conformativity, right? That I expect you to do this the same way every ballet person has done it before, right? That's a different kind of sensibility, and so it's important to name what's creative practice and what is not creative practice about the field. There is some level of training, and these are the things, this is the step I expect you to know, so that when you do create and generate work, that you have this step and the step is there for you. But we're learning slowly in the field that training is not a mandate, right? Like training is not a requirement. So we're even starting to pull away the notion of training and expertise to remember, particularly with bodies and creativity, that people's lived experience and ability to track and be clear and be discerning about their voice and what they're actually trying to say is actually the key, not the back training. You don't need to have your leg up by your ear. It's not necessary. It's not necessary. That's actually another conforming structure. of elitism, of like, you get to have your foot up and this person doesn't have their foot up, so they don't fit here, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's what that is, right? So there are even different ways of approaching arts in the arts, right? So, and these are things that we're hoping to help people track when they're looking and considering art and making conscious choices about what art they are attracted to.
Mm-hmm.
Can I just say thank you for that, Crystal, because I feel like you can extend that even to beyond the arts and even how we do programming and our administrative work on our campus, right? That there is a particular way that we do things and we don't always know why, right? There are many ways that we come into these spaces and we just conform to the culture, may not always be asking questions, and then are wondering like, oh, why is it that students of various cities and marginalized experiences are perceiving our campus in different ways, right? That we actually we are not always taught to ask those questions around why do we do it this way? Is this the only way to do this? Are there other possibilities? And so what you are all doing within the arts also extends to how we think about our professional work, how we think about our activism.
And how we think about our scholarship, who we cite for credibility. Why do I have to cite this person again? And yet, unless you do, you haven't earned the right to be creative and expand that scholarship. And I resent that deeply because when I was in the writing program, back to Crystal's point, we read and privileged white literary aesthetics, right? And I never felt like what I said would match that. But until you can also understand the narrative structure of this so-called formula that you have to follow, and yet some people in your class could also break those norms, but when you do it, it's challenged and you never understand why. I think in scholarship, back to Jazmin, in terms of work, but in the academy, we do that quite a bit. We have to nod at certain scholarship, but that scholarship has been predominantly white men. How do you break those boundaries when you keep replicating the same practices and the same perspective that continues to oppress students of color? So there's that piece. Shige, may I invite you into this question?
I mean, I'm thinking back to the core question, right? And it was both about how do we move from just anti-racism to justice, and it was also about intersectionality. And I think the intersectionality is really discussing interlocking oppressions, really talking about identity, and anti-racism is really talking about identity. And I think that justice is larger than identity-based work. It is inextricably linked to it. But I think that it's a much broader platform. And so I partly, we can also address like what are really concrete practices to engage, but I think that this is a space for really big philosophical questions. What is justice? What is liberation? What are these things? Because you can include someone, you can include somebody who's multiply marginalized into an oppressive system, and so I think this leads to questions like, what is academia? What is research? What is higher education? What are credentials? Why do these things exist? And when we don't question those things, I think that, and I'm not saying we're going to question them and have, clear answers to what to do with that, but I think if we don't question them, we're sort of just reproducing a lot of what already exists and not asking, well, what could be larger about why this doesn't exist? It isn't just about like Black trans women should like have degrees. Yes, I mean, that's true, but also like, what is the purpose of a college degree? Why are we making it so hard for people to get jobs and to need certain degrees for them? Is that real? Is that based on actual like skills? And things that will make people unsafe if you don't have this degree and you take this job? Or is this a gatekeeping mechanism or lots of other things, right? So I think like it leads us to question capitalism. It leads us to question what justice means. and all the things we've been programmed to believe about what justice means. So that's where I would take it. It's just as a huge, longer conversation to have at another time, but or we can extend it now. But I think that to me, that's where it starts to lead to, is that it really starts exploding from this question of how do we move to a justice model.
Yeah, can I just jump in here? Yes, Shige. Yes, all the things. To your point, one of the things I've been kind of offering and hoping to unpack in my bias research is similar to what Shige is saying. This a bias journal, where there's a practice of constantly asking yourself, what does this mean to me? Why is this more important than this? Right? What does justice mean for me? What does good dance mean for me? Right? Like, what do the words mean? And why am I defining, for example, what does dance mean? And then what is good dance? And why are these qualifiers what make it good? And why is that the bar? And how does that bar connect to my socialization, the messages I've received in my life, right? Why do I like hip hop and not country, and never the two shall mix, right? These are the questions aesthetically, right? That we should, I personally feel like it could be an ongoing practice of tracking these things, right? That we need to get into.
Crystal, I love that so much, because it captures something that I wanted to share, which is that, like, part of this work is about sweating the small stuff. It is about the details. It is asking those questions that we so often want to just jump into. Well, let's change policies, let's change practices, but we actually don't spend the time doing the groundwork of unpacking and unlearning, like, why is this considered rational and logical and the only way to do this, right? And that once we can sort of dig deep enough to get some clarity around that we can then think about what are some small shifts that we can begin to make, and that they're actually cumulative, right? That when we begin to value the importance of pronouncing someone's name and saying it correctly, or honoring people's pronouns, or even just simple things like regularly asking for permission and consent, when you are in classroom spaces, programming spaces where folks are reflecting, and you're like, oh, I'm going to ask them something that may be something they're not ready to share, and I want them to know they get to say no, right? That, like, those small practices actually deepen our understanding of how we understand valuing people's humanity and why that's important. And so sweating the small stuff, sweating the details actually helps us get to, here's how we make policy changes, here's how we shift practices, that you don't just start at the top, you actually have to incrementally work your way up there.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Okay, we have 2 more questions to go. This is so great. But if I may, I'm going to move to the next question. But I have so many comments to make. This is so great. Okay, Crystal, may I ask you to think about a time when your internalized dominance, for example, your internalized racism or sexism, negatively affected your ability to be anti-racist in your role? How did you become aware of it? How did you respond to your internalized attitudes? What have you done to further unlearn the internalized dominance? And I suppose this could tie to those standards. So
yeah, I love this question, because a lot of my research is around failure and what it has to teach us and how juicy it is as a site for learning. So, like, yay to failure, and also yay to letting go of your ego to let down sharing forward a fail, because a fail is a site of learning for yourself and for others, right? So the other thing, shout out to University of Maryland, because I had this as a job interview question of, like, where have you failed in terms of your implicit biases, right? And that the person who interviewed me graduated out of our education program, and I'll never forget, the question was part of the reason I took that job, right? Because of that thoughtful question. So now I won't stall anymore. I'll tell you my my failing. I was teaching a studio class. It was actually a somatic movement class, meaning kind of body, mind, internal work, sensate feeling work, that often is defined in terms of gender assumptions and stereotypes with femininity, with fem structures, right? I was teaching it to a majority male identifying athletic student at a wealthy private school.
Mm.
So the class was predominantly athletes, both white and Black students, but mostly male identifying, with only 2 female identifying students in the class, right? And what was happening was I was leading with my assumption that these cis male identifying students are going to be uncomfortable with the content. So I was catering to them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I was asking them more questions. I was encouraging them to speak. I was, celebrating the answers that I thought were really thoughtful. And the girls who tended to be quiet in general were even more quiet in this class, right? Now, of course, there were, because these were actually high school students, there was the social dynamic, I'm sure, in the room as well. But it wasn't until I actually had someone come in and observe me that I was able to track this. I was not able to track this for myself, right? So this is why it's important to really welcome people that you trust in to give you feedback on you need to have an accountability crew, right, in place to call you when you know that you trust their word, right? And so this observer let me know that they were tracking the numbers of times I called on the boys in the class and how many times I called on the girls. Yep. So as a correction, I felt like I had a strong enough connection with all the folks in the class. After that observation feedback, I went back to them. And as high school students that were really kind of doing great work in the class, I let them know, based on that observation, that I had a bias. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That I had a bias. And I talked about the bias. I talked about where it came from, maybe, and my assumptions. And I let the 2 girl students know that I would be calling on them more. And it wasn't because I was trying to single them out, but because I was trying to self-correct. And if it started to feel uncomfortable, or if things started to feel weird in terms of how I was navigating, they could come to me, because this is something I'm working through and I'm not perfect at yet. And I needed their feedback. So that's what happened in that class. So I'm still working. It was a learning process. I kind of journal, reflect, and adapt the classes as I go. But yeah, that was my example.
Thank you, Crystal. That absolutely, I think as teachers, we can all appreciate what you've just said. The ways that class instruction is usually also geared toward is to support white students. And I say that very explicitly, even when we're talking about anti-racism, our starting point of where we enter that conversation is absolutely not the same as when you're addressing a room full of BIPOC students. Not to say that all BIPOC students share the same racial literacies, but to the extent that we think about who we teach to and for whom it's benefit, it's ingrained in how we shape the classroom conversation, who we privilege, who do we clap and say, yes, you did really well. It silences students of color, and in particular, Black students. And I say that, go ahead, I'm sorry.
I don't want to interrupt, but it really was also a function of my assumptions about cis, femme, gender, where somatics is. They're not going to be ready for the yoga and the meditation. It was this thing as well. So it was not only my conditioning socially around gender and around privileging what was majority white boys with a few Black boys there, or privileging those athletes that were popular at the school, right? That could have been another perspective that I was anchoring, and I'm owning kind of my hegemonic buy-in, right, to privileging them. But it was also my assumption that they wouldn't be going with me, because this was identified as some sort of femme practice, right? Mm-hmm. Which was not where they were fine. I was making an assumption and imposing that in the classroom.
Yes, no, I can appreciate that. In my whiteness class, I think that when we're thinking about the starting point of conversations, we just go right into it. And the assumption is that white students aren't ready to talk about it. They might say they're not ready to talk about it, but they are ready to talk about it as well. And they will participate at the starting point that you set up. And where you start does matter because it leads to a different outcome. And so I think that making those assumptions of who's going to buy in, that's also a deficit toward the rest of the students, right? The implication that white students aren't ready, in my case, aren't ready to talk about race. That's not true. They know how to talk about race. They have a white racial knowledge. They know. How do you create that space where we can have those contact zone, right? That places where there's tension, but also to talk through the privilege and the power and such. So I appreciate your acknowledgement of that. I'd like to ask Jazmin and Shige if you would like to comment on this question as well in terms of internalized dominance. Do you?
I'm happy. I'll share quickly like the ways that it's shown up rather than sharing a personal experience. I think it's really important to hold that, again, even as we're trying to do anti-racist work, right? White supremacy culture, we are still swimming in it. And historically, the way we've entered like anti-racist classrooms, social justice classrooms, have really been to center the learning of white students and the unlearning that white students have to do, right? And that students of color and Black students might be in that space in ways to share their stories to support white students learning when we're not actually paying attention to students of color development or other marginalized students development in that classroom space. And so this question around like, how does your internalized dominance show up? How does your internalized oppression show up? Feels like a really advanced question, but it is actually a question that marginalized students are really adept and able to answer. Right? That when we actually shift our focus in an anti-racist social justice classroom space to really thinking about the ways that we can all cause harm, that we all have dominant identities and can use those dominant identities to oppress, right? We actually shift the conversation so that our spaces are really about the growth and development of all students and not just using the stories of some populations for other people's learning. What that has looked like in the Words of Engagement program, our intergroup dialogue program, we have an assignment where students really have to, their final assignment is to write about a bias that they have either about their own group or another, and explicitly talking about how does this bias uphold systems of oppression or how is it informed, right? Because sometimes students of color, marginalized students are talking about how they may be queer and they struggle with being perceived as femme, right? And so creating a space so that they can talk about both privilege and oppression or power and oppression as two sides of the same coin, that it's not just white bodies can be oppressors, that like we all are capable of causing that harm. So how do we interrogate that in ourselves?
Thank you, Jazmin. Shige?
I think that, so starting with more the solution and then the problem, but I think part of the solution is not only having all these discussions, but really thinking about what is a good practice and trying to implement more things that we think might be good practices. Share your name and pronouns, talk about name pronunciation, have tools where people can easily do these things and make that structurally available to them. I think about like why I tried to take this approach to some of the work we did with trans issues on campus. You know, having really specific things. You can say, do my front desk staff know where the nearest all gender restroom is? Have we fixed this signage? Have we added this to our syllabus? So they're very concrete things. And I'm not saying that's the panacea for anything, but I think that's super important. And the reason I do is because I think that all these like dominant things are very seductive, including for me, very seductive. And some of the ones that I kind of wrote down for this question were professionalism, you know, or the word respectability politics, even civility, even though I've written an editorial critiquing it. I think that there's a lot of cultural reasons and dominant culture reasons as well as to why it's easy to be like, I don't want to be in a conflictual kind of conversation right now. Or why I think I should dress a certain way or appear a certain way. And I'm not saying there's an answer, a clear answer to some of those things. But I think that it's very seductive for even for people that do equity, diversity, inclusion work full time to be like, well, I need to look a certain way in front of upper administration in order to effectively advocate for my students, or I need to look a certain way so I won't be attacked on the street. And that's both oppression and internalized oppression. And so there's a lot of complicated issues, I think, with that. But to me, some of the getting at the answers is the more we can shift culture by shifting practices, and not just like, because I think the other seductive thing is like having a difficult dialogue as the answer. That's the process. That's not the answer necessarily, right? There may be answers within that, but there might not be, right? Sometimes a difficult dialogue doesn't actually get us to the change in impact, the change in behavior that we need. So I think just paying attention that there's more than just, you know, struggling through ideas, because I think of like spiritual bypassing, and I think there's academic bypassing, where like we use some really interesting, cool theoretical language and said intersectionality and named a few theorists. And so now we feel better about the difficult issues that we face because we talked about them. Okay, but what's the actual outcome? What's the actual result? What are we actually doing after that?
Thank you. Thank you to our panelists. I think we have a fourth question, but I think that we can end with that fourth question at the very end, because that's the takeaway piece. So Carlton's going to join us now and offer us the list of questions that
right. So like I said, when I came on, right, people have really been interested in practice when it comes to anti-racism. And if you've been paying attention to the chat or even looking on Twitter, people are really having this conversation, really enjoying what it is that you all are putting out there. So really thank you for that. There's a lot of brilliance that's occurring in this conversation. I want to come to some questions that we have in the Q&A, as well as some that were sent in. I want to come back to this one that you all started addressing that does seem pretty important. People have said this over and over and over again. There was a version of, how do we do this work without centering white people? How do we do this work while not burdening or tokenizing people of color, right? Whether or not you are a teacher educator or you are a communicator on campus, whether or not you're an academic advisor, that seems to be one of the questions that's come in over and over and over and over again. How do we do this work without centering white people? And how do we do this work without burdening or tokenizing people of color? How about I come to you, Jazmin? Oh, Crystal, go ahead.
Yeah, I want to jump in because we're actively working through this in theater, dance, and performance studies. Dr. Green, you know, because you've been kind of coming in, but that we have had kind of every segment of our department, of our School of Theater, Dance, and Performance Studies, write up demands, requests, suggestions of what we need to do to move forward. It is incredibly complicated, right? But a couple of things that are showing up for me, there's this kind of balance and negotiation of not asking additional labor of Black folk that are also doing this weird thing of like, so you don't have to be on the committee of anti-racist work because we don't want to burden you. But this is a conversation, right, of a lived experience. That means you do actually still have to talk to Black folk, right? Like you, right? Like that, they still need to be there. So, and again, obviously, there is no right answer for that, but you have to hold space for both and imagine a possibility where both needs are met, right? Helping people, supporting people in their boundaries of this is how much work I'm willing to do and no more, right? As a person of color, or as a Black person. And honoring and finding solutions about that. Also, based on the work of scholar Maxine Green, her work keeps living in me for folks that are in education, and the work in the Lincoln Center that is based on her work, that there is something powerful about a big sheet of paper. Big sheet of paper. Write the answers, write the responses down, have them live in one place so that people can see them, and have them begin to merge, have them begin to overlay and integrate in ways that, while they were disparate ideas from different people, you can't see how they intersect and can create a solution unless you actually have them laid out in front of you visually in ways that people consider meeting the needs of all the things on that sheet of paper, right? I know that feels kind of, it may feel reductive, but I've just had a lot of success in people really naming a thing, and a facilitator that knows how to say, I hear you saying this, I hear you saying that. Is this a possible solution, or is there a solution to meet both of these needs, right? So I'll just stop there.
But I think what you're pointing to is the need for facilitation in these conversations sometimes, right? Yeah, so that's really important. Shige, Jazmin, Rossina?
I was going to share, yes, the needs for facilitation, and to our earlier point, like creating these multiple entry points so that we can meet those diverse needs. More and more, I really lean on the white supremacy culture, which is becoming a big part of our work, in that we sometimes still sit in the oppression is present when white bodies are present. And we actually need to shift our thinking to think about, like, how is our culture connected to white supremacy, right? How can white supremacy be present even when white bodies aren't in the room, right? How do we hold and carry that? That if we can have that conversation, it actually forces us to decenter white bodies and really think about white supremacist ideologies and logics and values that we have learned not to question. So if we move away from who tends to be in power, that body that we tend to associate with power, and think about, like, how is it actually in our culture and the ways that we see the world, understand the world, the ways that we do our work, right? How have we been socialized to do those things? We begin to move away from, it's not just white people and the opportunities and resources that they have and they hoard. It actually is about, like, the water we've been drinking.
To the original question, I actually don't know that it's possible, at least on a collective level, to not burden BIPOC people or communities, at least on a collective level, and do this work, this dismantling white supremacy. But we're also burdened by white supremacy as it is. I think there's a difference, though, between burdened and burnout and tokenization that was also brought up, right? So I think there are ways we can avoid burnout, we can avoid tokenization, but I think that it's a fine line, because you don't want, like, people making decisions for marginalized people who are not that community. So there has to be some agency there, but it also has to be a question of, like, do you have capacity to do this right now? How can I support you in doing this right now if this is what you want to do? Or do you need a break? Do you want to not do this? Do you not want to engage? And on the individual level, there may be some people who are not here to engage. It's too traumatic at this moment, right? And needing to personally heal and recharge in some way. So I just was kind of resonating or thinking a little bit about this question of how do we not burden BIPOC communities? And I feel like the answer is, I don't know that that's collectively possible. And I think that it's also harmful to not ask people if they want to be involved, right? Or want to have a voice within decisions that affect their lives. And I've seen this play out where maybe an LGBT group decides what trans people need, but there's really only one trans person in that group and they're not being listened to. And so I think we have the same within, like, we may say BIPOC, but who are we actually talking about for specific conversations? Are we talking about Black folks, and are we actually centering Black folks when we're doing that? Or is it like all the other non-Black people of color are going to decide what the solution is? So I think it's very complicated. And I think that it's a fine line to make sure people are invited, included, but also supported and not burnt out, and have agency in how we move these things forward.
Let me add a question, but I see you want to come on, Crystal, and I think Rossina wants to say something about this too, but there's a question that came in today that is right in this area. So we'll still be in the same area, right? The person said, in recent social justice movements, particularly the resurgence of BLM this past summer. I've observed Black communities taking leadership over their demands of what change should look like and how it's enacted. There was this rhetoric that non-Black people have no right to dictate how Black people express themselves or create change. How do I, and I'm assuming this person is maybe not a Black person, how do I support Black communities and Black folks who have very strong ideas of how to approach social justice that does not seem to abide by the principle of there being no one right way to do anti-racist work? So still in the same area. So Crystal, Rossina.
I just wanted to remember to bring it, again, dance for person, to bring it back to the body, that some of the things that we're talking about are small interactional slights in the room that can throw and derail an entire process. I'm thinking of, there was apparently a Canadian person who was doing that. Do you know about this? The knitting, that they would knit and change color every time there was a female identifying or male identifying representative that was voicing. And if the red was for the men and the green was for the women, the person had a majority red scarf by the time she ended up tracking the thing that was in the room, right? How much space do you take up? Sit in, if you're having a moment of discomfort of hearing that Black folks maybe hearing, and I'm kind of assuming in the question that you're feeling excluded or that your voice isn't being heard. Sit into what it feels like, and sometimes the empathy of what it may have felt like for folks, Black folk, to be that person in the room is the learning moment, is the learning lesson for that moment. So that you have empathy for what it means to say, I need you to sit tight for a second and let us have a voice about this and give us a minute, right? We'll get back to you in a minute. I've had white students who are tracking this for themselves in the discomfort, and kind of somatically for a mind body thing to sit and process what it feels like, and to start to track and unravel why you feel uncomfortable not taking up more space in the room. Why do you feel uncomfortable not having a central voice, or a voice that you feel like is a significant voice in the experiences of somebody else, right? To really track that for yourself and track what it's feeling like and what the sources are for that. I'll leave it at that.
Rossina, were you going to add something to that question?
I think what everybody said was already brilliant. And I do want to reiterate Shige's point that it's impossible and to not burden BIPOC communities when we're looking at anti-racist work. I do think that we need to explicitly, even if we don't center white people, as Jazmin is saying, we have to call out the systems of oppression, which is white supremacy. Without naming, the explicit naming, we are evading the conversation about the asymmetrical power. So it has to be named at all times. That's why I'm constantly saying white, right? And it's not dominant, it's white dominance. It's a very specific kind within the US that we have to be able to confront. Now, to Crystal's point, I think the idea of decentering Blackness happens within communities of color. When we're doing social justice work, there is a decentering of Blackness. It happens. And I think what it means, and Shige, I love the quote that you have up here of not every space, not every conversation is for me for that moment. I think the assumption is that if there's a centralizing of Black communities, then suddenly it's a zero-sum game and you don't get a piece of that conversation, and you have to always feel the need for Black people to step aside, because the dehumanization of Black people, it's embedded in our thinking. So when we're asking, what about me? That is a very white epistemology. It is assuming very individualistic framework where you're saying that if it's all focused on Black communities, then it can't include me. That does not forge coalition work. It just doesn't. So.
Great, thank you.
To add to that, it's also the sitting with what is it about Black folks, Black communities exercising and exerting their own agency around their lived experiences that is unsettling for me.
Right.
Okay, so here's the next question. There's a really bigger question that's sort of like, actually shifts a little bit away from Blackness into something else. It says, this person wrote, to Shige's point about reparations, is anyone on campus raising the issue of free tuition for Black, Latinx, and Native American students? Also, has anyone suggested that the university give back campus land to local Native American people and provide funding to build a new Native American studies building? I believe Michigan public universities have offered free tuition to Native Americans for decades. So certainly there's some big policy questions here. I think what the person is getting at is, what are we doing, like at the systems level? What would we want to be recommending when it comes to actualizing anti-racism work on our campus? Shige, do you want to start with that one?
I would say I'm not entirely sure. There may be some panelists who know more what is currently happening. I know that there's been some historical work related to associations of the institution with slavery or with the land that we're on. I think there's a lot more work that needs to be done here to like actualize that. I'm thinking of like Georgetown as an example of one institution that has tried to take more concrete steps. And a lot of that came out of student activism. So I think there's a lot of opportunity at Maryland to push that forward. I'm not 100% sure on where some of those things stand right now.
Let me say something. Like I said, I feel like they're asking some really concrete things. And what I'm thinking about is, are there ways that we can think about, maybe if we want to suggest these pieces, or are there other sort of like policy related or practice or systemic issues that we would want the university to be leaning into when it comes to doing this type of anti-racism work?
I think yes. I mean, I think there are, and I think we need to talk about where we put money. And, I think that I don't know enough about all the history of it, but I think as an institution, I've experienced that we're very afraid to do some of this work because of some lawsuit that we lost decades ago, right? That, doing identity-based work or serving specific people because of the histories of oppression or the current oppression that they face has been something that I think sometimes we shy away from because of legal reasons, right? Or the history of some of the legal things. And I think this had to do with a scholarship that was previously being offered by the institution, and it was being offered based on race, and the courts ultimately didn't feel that we had rationalized why well enough. And instead of trying to rationalize better, we've kind of shied away from doing some of that work. So I think we have to go back into that discussion and say, actually, we need better research. We need to talk more about what's happening in our populations and actually like move money, move actual resources. But I think the same goes to like diversity offices, trainings, all these things that we say we want. How much more money are we really going to put towards that is also part of the question.
Anyone else? Broader sort of like suggestions for how do we adapt an anti-racist personality or perspective? Okay, we can shift into the final question, and I'll ask it so that you can also participate, Rossina. So the last question that we wanted to ask people was, to promote your own growth, who are you reading? What organizations are you connected to? What social media do you follow? Who do you spend time with? How do you nurture your own anti-racism development? Jazmin, were you going to start with this one?
I can.
Okay.
To hit multiple points, I love, Crystal, you calling it an accountability crew, because in many ways I have a close circle of Black women friends whom we talk about all things that run the political and identity gamut, and that serves as accountability for me. Being in deep community with some of our students, right? That looks like following some of the student activists on Instagram and social media, just to see like, what are they talking about? What is important to them? As a grad student, I do very little reading for fun, but I'm really huge on podcasts. So all things NPR, Code Switch, In the Thick, Kimberly Crenshaw's Intersectionality Matters. It just in terms of thinking about intersectionality in ways that are really grounded and everyday. Self-evident Asian American stories, right? So also creating space for myself to learn about other communities' experiences as I'm also doing my work and understanding my own communities. Radio Caña Negra. For social media, in terms of national orgs, Culture Strike is wonderful. The Movement for Black Lives, Law for Black Lives. I also do this work with my family. We're predominantly Spanish speaking and immigrant, so Dichos de un Bicho, Soy Si Guapa. And then the very practical, concrete social justice healing, decolonizing therapy, and anti-racism every day. Like if you want quick tips for like, how do I put this in practice in my everyday? Those are really great. I'll put them in the chat box as well, because I was just like, oh, all of the resources, let me give them all away.
Who else? How are you continuing your own self-development around anti-racism work? I'm gonna have to call it Crystal.
Yeah, I'll just say I'm in the throes of writing a book right now. There is no time. I did giggle a little bit, Jazmin. Me too. It's like, who are you reading for fun? I was like, fun? What's that? I don't really. But there is something about things that shifted this summer that threw me deeper into my work. Like this is an opportunity to exercise the research that I'm doing. I am really shifting into racial trauma work for people who do the embodied work. Race Manakam's work. My Grandmother's Hand is, I think, his most recent book. And there is a wonderful talking about accountability cruise, Jazmin. Kareem Bell has an organization that she runs on racial trauma that actually has a organized group. It's called Rooted. And I participate, you're split into your affinities, and that you have a facilitator walk you through the book and through your physical embodied sensate experiences and triggers around race to unpack those as a group and as a community, and in a safe space with those who the affinity groups are protective, and that you're not having to deal with other folks' kind of assault of their process of unpacking how they're thinking about race. And I can share the links to those in the chat.
Great, thanks, Crystal. How about you, Shige?
I think friendships and family and collegial relationships are super important to doing this work and to being in community with different kinds of people, including my own communities, which are internally diverse, and including with all kinds of other groups. So I think that like thinking about that, some of that takes place for me in terms of like within my professional associations, within just one-to-one contacts that I have in my work. But I'm thinking about like news too, and just how I kind of, as we're all super busy, at least when we get the buzz of headlines or kind of like people trying to say, hey, this is what's important. I'm a Facebook user, and so I try to see what I can follow that's maybe going to give me different perspectives than the ones that I would get just following like US mainstream media. So some of that for me is Huffington Post Black Voices, BBC Africa, Japan Times, NHK World Japan, El País, Aristegui Noticias. Those are just a few of the things that I try to follow, so I know what's happening in other regions or countries, or other languages or spaces than just what I might prioritize. Nap Ministry, I think, is a wonderful space to get some ideas about rest and how that is also a justice practice and rooted. Asian Pacific Americans in higher education, diverse revolutionary Unitarian Universalist multicultural ministries. I'm in different non-binary groups, including in other countries, so that I can sort of get a sense of what's happening with other folks. I try not to like take up space in those, but it does give me a way to know what's happening in other languages and spaces. So those are a few of the ways, even though I'm like, I don't have time to show up for everything or be in every conversation. How can I at least get the headlines every now and then? That is one way.
And let's go to Rossina last.
Thank you. This question makes me think about community and the importance of community for me. I have said many times in various situations that I am nothing without my community. And were it not specifically for Black women scholars and critical racial Asian American women scholars who have supported me and uplifted me and given me the opportunities and elevated me in ways that they have, I wouldn't be here today. And so I think a lot about how I can do that in my own work every day and do what my peer sisters, peer sister mentors have done for me. I read many articles as part of my job, books, all of it. But above all, I think the most important things that I do read are my students' work. I am very privileged to be in a program that I work with very, very diverse student populations. And I listen to their perspectives. I have so many oversights because of my positionality as an Asian American woman that in order for me to better understand, I have to decenter many things that I have learned over the years and then really listen to their counter narratives. So the work that my students do, they have given me that space and trusted me with their drafts. And those drafts have become text for me, so.
Okay, great. Thank you all so much for this conversation. I think that, again, from the chat and from what we're seeing on Twitter, people have really appreciated your contributions today. I want to encourage people to sign up for the ODI newsletter in order to be able to continue to get information about the teach-in and other activities that are being sponsored by ODI right now around UMD solidarity and anti-racism. Allison, can you drop the link for people to sign up to the newsletter in the chat? That'd be great. I also just want to thank these people who are brilliantly giving of themselves today. Crystal, thank you so much for being here and bringing your perspective, especially referring us back to our bodies. It feels so important for us to be talking about that right now. Jazmin, for all of the, I was getting a private text message from somebody who was talking about they have an intellectual crush on you because you're just one of the smartest people that we know here at the institution. To Shige for bringing so much of your incredible insight to how it is that we should be thinking about doing this work and reminding us, right, that this is not just always sort of like person level work, but there is just a larger system that we find ourselves in. And Rossina, for your brilliant moderation of the panel and thinking on your feet to bring in to like your own thoughts while also listening and paying attention to everybody else and their contributions. Thank you all so much for being here. We really appreciate it. Check out the other teach-ins that are on our ODI YouTube page. You can see the other brilliance that has been going on since the summer. Hopefully in December, we'll be bringing you one last teach-in for the fall semester, which will primarily focus on bringing back some of our past panelists to talk about what they've been thinking about and even how they can answer some of the questions that we didn't get to throughout the teach-in. So thank you all once again. We really appreciate it. We look forward to having you be a part of this conversation. Oh, and thank you to Allison Dickinson here in the Office of Diversity and Inclusion, to Tamia Webster here in ODI, and to the folks over in public health, both Erin McClure and Brielle Merchant, for all of their wonderful assistance with making these programs happen. Thank you all so much. We'll see you the next time.